Today we're going to be looking at the earliest forms of religious belief. These are also called basic religions. They used to be called primitive religions by Westerners and anthropologists who went to study these cultures and felt that these ways of looking at religion were less advanced than the more theologically defined religions of the West. The larger the system of God and the more text around it, that was seen as what defined a modern religion. And in most early religions, there is no text. There are just practices and oral traditions. And these traditions are going to be very powerful. We're going to focus on the first 5 things here: animism, magic, divination, totems, and taboo. These are very important aspects of the earliest forms of religious practice, and they still exist today in some form. If you think about it, we still have taboos. We still connect to totems through school and university mascots. We believe in divination, some of us, when we go to astrologers or psychics. Many of us still believe in magic in some ways. If you believe in lucky numbers, or if you think about things that might bring you success in sports or whatever your extracurricular interests are. And animism is interesting too, our connection to the spirit world in some way. So we're going to begin with animism. And animism is the belief that soul or spirit exists in every object. So early peoples believed that spirits and souls cause life in humans, or there was a connection between humans and not only animals, but also things like rocks, like this rock in Aboriginal Australia called the Uluru. It's a very unusual sandstone outcropping in the middle of a semi-arid area. It looks like it was just plopped out of the sky. And particularly at sunset and sunrise, it turns this amazing orange color, which is because of the magnetism of the rock. So there's actually a magnetic field around this rock, which literally draws people to it. And so this rock was considered to have a large and powerful spirit to it. And very, very important to the Aboriginal peoples. There were a whole lot of rites around it where young people would go off on walkabouts where they would find their own connection to spirit animals and to the spirit. But this was the sort of the anchor of this particular tradition. You'll notice this connection to rocks also exists in the Middle East, particularly in what's now Saudi Arabia. Here we are in Mecca. That's the Kaaba, which is the center of the mosque there. And you'll notice on one corner there's a black stone. That's a meteorite, and that gets worshipped even today. That's part of the Hajj. People come and touch that stone, and it's a nod to the fact that before the people in that region converted to Islam, they were animists. They believed in the connection to stones and the connection to the spirits in the desert around them, which if you've ever seen a mirage makes a lot of sense, because there was a lot of movement and activity in the spirit world in that region. So if you think about modern parallels to animism, we literally animate trees. We put lights in it. This comes from a Germanic tradition of animism, which involved hanging dead animals in trees, which is interesting. If you think about the ornaments on your trees, they mimic that tradition in some ways, even though you're not aware of it. You may say that we don't think of the faces on Mount Rushmore as literal spirits, but it has symbolic importance. It connects us to the important presidents. Now, if Trump has his way, he'll be up there too, communicating with the great spirits of our nation. You also see it with gravestones. Gravestones, we don't worship the stones, but the stones become kind of a symbol of the spirit of the person in some ways, kind of indirectly. You see it with trees that are memorialized. We have trees around Concord Carlisle that are memorials to students who've passed away, or parents, sometimes teachers, and they're all around us. So we're connecting the spirit life of the tree to the person. Cornerstones, memorial stones, diamonds, even people who protest for environmental reasons, the importance of the spirit of trees. And of course, if you read in biology, there's a lot of complex spirit life in trees. If you want to get into the relationship in plant roots and so forth, that's a whole other topic we can get into maybe another time. So the second thing is magic. Magic is the effort to try to coerce nature or control nature through rites and ceremonies. So if you think about sympathetic magic, if you're familiar with voodoo dolls, what you have to do is you have to get a piece of someone's hair or fingernails or even some of their skin, and you make it into a doll or a representation of them. And then through the manipulation of that doll, you can manipulate that person. Right? So in James Bond movies, you used to stick pins in it and it would cause somebody to feel pain, for example. Now, magic is interesting because it's connected to this idea that we can control things through actions. If you don't step on the crack when you're a little kid, nothing bad will happen. That's an idea of magical thinking, controlling your world through actions. So to give another example of this, the ghost dance in the late 1900s, after the Civil War, as the Native Americans were being pushed off their land for the final time, there was a massive religious revival led by a holy man named Wovoka. He was a Sioux Indian who believed that if the Indians continued to do this ghost dance, which is a dance to their ancestors, that they would throw the soil in the air, which is again the connection of the soil to the remains of their ancestors. You can see that in the foreground. That it would cause the white people to float, basically, no, not the white people, the Native Americans to float up into the sky. The white people would die away and the plains would be returned to their original state. It's a little bit like what you see in the book of Revelation, the idea that the believers will be held up and that the non-believers will go to hell. And what's fascinating about this is when they fought white people, they also believed in the ghost shirts would protect them. So there was a magic not only in terms of the collective protection of the tribe, but also the individual protection of the warriors. So if you think about modern examples of magic, horseshoes, good luck charms, rabbit's feet, you may have a lucky number or believe in lucky pennies or four-leaf clovers. Rainbows are another example of good luck as well. You see modern symbolic magic in a number of ways. We could elaborate on that, but this picture gives you further examples of that. The next aspect of basic religion is divination. Now, divination is the prediction of the future. And the prediction of the future often happens by consulting with authorities. So here in the Oracle of Delphi, which was one of the most famous forms of divination, you have here one of the Pythian priestesses of Apollo, and she has purified herself in the waters of a fountain before she sits down over this vent of hot air that comes up from the ground. This was a volcanic area. She would eat laurel leaf or eucalyptus, inhale the vapors coming up from the chasm, and the priests would align around her. You can see the priests behind her. And she would enter into this ecstatic state and start speaking in tongues. And they would interpret the predictions that she would give. So people would come and ask their questions. Will I get married? Who will I marry? Will I be successful in business? Any question that the oracle would answer. So other examples of this, in Rome, you have augury, which is following the flights of birds and interpreting the flights of birds as a way to predict the future. In China, you have the heating of tortoise shells and the cracking of it, suggesting divination and how the future would be predicted. You have the reading of tea leaves in primarily in China and Japan, which is how the tea leaves dry in the bottom of a cup. And then you have tarot cards. Some people still do tarot card readings today, which is another form of European divination. Modern examples, astrology and horoscopes, these are all ways in which we look to the stars or we look to things beyond ourselves to predict the future. The last thing I want to focus on today is taboo, coming from the Tongan Tapu, which is a southeastern Pacific tribe. And if you look at the things around which taboos form, they frequently form around powerful people, kings, around the words and names of people, which were seen as connecting to their identity, around food and the purification of food, around sacred places. This is why we whisper in church. Rites of passage, menstruation, and interestingly enough, knots, which were seen as a tying up of the energy in the world around us. So what you see here is taboo. Sometimes, if you look at the lower right, protection of marriage. It was one reason why religious people were, particularly conservative Christians, were so opposed to gay marriage, because it was a taboo. If you look at the lower left, kosher eating laws in Judaism, these are also ways of thinking about protecting purity and mandated forms of eating, which are also protected by taboos. So if you look at the reasons for taboo, around the chief on the left, or around food on the lower left, around an animal, particularly sacred animals. So if you are connected with them through as a spirit animal, you obviously don't want to be killing them or mistreating them anyway. So often veneration or celebration of the animal is actually tied into the taboo. If you're going to be celebrating something, you have to protect it, and you protect it through magical forms of actions. In the lower right, you have people in a sweat lodge. These are men going through a rite of passage. That rite of passage needs to be protected. One final thing are totems. Totems are symbolic representations of an entire tribe. They usually connect to large mammals, but you also have totems to things like fish. Totems can even include spirits that aren't part of the natural world, but are kind of part of a larger world. So this is basically a summary of how basic religions work. We'll talk about sacrifice another time. But if we go back to all of these things, what I want you to think about is to what extent these still impact the way that we think about religion today.